Our speaker today is Terry Nicholson, and she's going to be speaking to us about harbor seals, specifically what you see on there, social behavior of harbor seals in the context of mating strategy. She's also going to be touching on their underwater behaviors as well as identification. Terry has over 21 years of experience in this field. She studied harbor seals both for her undergraduate and graduate work, and continues working today studying harbor seals as a field researcher and biologist with the Monterey Bay Aquarium SORAC program. Please welcome Terry Nicholson.
Thank you so much. How does the microphone sound? It's okay? All right, great. It's really wonderful to be here today, especially because I get to talk about harbor seals, and harbor seals are really true to my heart. I don't know if you see the title under there, but I'm actually a Monterey Bay Aquarium sea otter research and conservation biologist now. So I promise you that I do know a little bit about harbor seals. I did do all my graduate study work and undergraduate study with harbor seals at Hopkins Marine Station. But since completing that work, now I get to study sea otters, but occasionally I can divert my telescope over to watch harbor seals, and I haven't presented this material probably in over a decade, so I updated it a little bit, and I think the information is still pretty relevant. Most of the observations I'm going to talk about today are focused on underwater, which is where I think you really, really have to be if you want to understand these animals. So the two pictures depicted up there, there's a female on the left and males doing some kind of raucous behavior that we'll talk about more on the right, and we'll hopefully by the end of this talk you'll understand a little bit more about what they're doing and how it relates to getting them together to produce these beautiful pups that you all are taking pictures of on this Easter weekend. So for that, let's go to the next slide. So most of what we know about pinniped mating strategy is what we've learned by looking at species that mate on land. Pinniped mating strategies are polygynous, so males get to mate with more than one female if they're lucky. And what determines how many females they get is how well they compete with other males for access to females or the resources that they require. And that works really well for sea lions. So you notice these are the three different pinniped species that you probably, do you guys see elephant seals at Point Lobos occasionally? Rarely, but they come along. So that works well for Central California. The sea lions, this works to mate on land. They do very well on land. And then they mate on offshore islands off of California and Mexico, so they avoid predation. It works well for sea lions. They're just big enough and bad enough to pretty much mate wherever they want, often in the middle of Highway 1 down near San Diego. But for sea lions, I think one of them took on a Volkswagen bus. And the elephant seal won. So. But when it comes to harbor seals, they're incredibly, they're relatively clumsy, and they're shy animals, and they've chosen their strategies to mate underwater in a three-dimensional environment where males cannot control females or the resources that they require, so they have to come up with a strategy to woo a female. And believe it or not, although it seems like a long time ago now, but when I was an undergraduate in 1991, it was they just made some recordings of underwater vocalizations. People thought harbor seals were quiet. And when you hear them on land, there are a few growls and grunts here and there, but they're nothing like a pack or a group of sea lions. So people assume they were quiet underwater, which was obviously not the case. Next slide, please. So the big question for my undergraduate and graduate thesis was, why do these animals vocalize, and what's the social context in terms of their social and mating strategy? And the best way to kind of start to look at that is to understand how kind of social context or community structure can affect how vocalizations are used in other pinnipeds that mate underwater and that we have a little bit more information about. So, in species that are more solitary, one example is the leopard seal, lives in the Antarctic. These animals are distributed widely, not in very dense numbers, and actually males and females use vocalizations to find each other when females come into estrus, because they may be so far apart. A pinniped is generally in estrus just for a few days, and if she can't find a mate, that's a problem. So, interesting that enough males and females of that species vocalize just to find each other. On the other side of the spectrum, you have pinnipeds that live in colonial, large groupings, such as the walrus, who aggregate on the ice floes in these big numbers. And they're much like sea lions, they're very raucous, and it's believed that they vocalize in the water in kind of an arena. They call them lecking displays. That's a term I think most often used for bird aggregations, but they kind of apply it to pinnipeds as well. But because females are gathered, males gathered in these arenas and will kind of vocalize around each other, displaying, and maybe females are able to assess what male they would like to mate with. So then on the other, the kind of the middle spectrum are the bearded seals, who distribute themselves on kind of the pack ice, and they're distributed they're very much like harbor seals in a way, in terms of their density, I think, and they have a tendency to space themselves out a little bit along the pack ice, so they have little underwater territories, and then females can decide. So you can hit the slide forward, and so the question is really to kind of determine, and you can hit it again, to see where harbor seals kind of fit into this spectrum. Next slide. So again, the question for my thesis and a lot of the underwater work that I did was, what's the social function of this underwater vocalization? And these were kind of the 5 key steps that I'm going to focus on for the rest of the talk. The location, I can't really emphasize enough, is really important. And you have to, again, it's 1991, and which I can't really believe it's even before really the internet was commercially available to us all. So it's becoming a long time, almost a generation ago, but it seems like just yesterday. But a lot had gone on, and nobody had really known very much. So location was important in moving forward to answer these questions. Underwater observations, essential. Again, these animals, I totally respect people, and I love to be out there with my camera taking pictures of these animals on the beaches and the pups, but it's almost like going into their bedroom at night and taking pictures, because they're nocturnal, they're sleeping, there's not a lot happening. And if you think about, I just had a baby a year and a half ago, and I spent my nights up, nursing and sleeping and napping. Anyway, so really to see what these animals are doing, you need, to see them underwater is a totally different animal, and it's often happening, not in the middle of the day, but in the early mornings or in the evenings as they're heading off to hunt. Individual identification is so important, and I can honestly say that no harbor seal was injured or harassed during the study. It did not require tagging. It did not require instrumentation, which is something we do to sea otters ad nauseum. But I felt really good about this study because harbor seals have a perfect fingerprint in their pelage pattern that lasts their entire life. So once you know a seal, you'll know it for life. The next step is, once you know those individuals, you need to follow them for a long, enough period of time, for several years, to kind of understand who's doing what to whom and what, how often, and who else is watching. And that leads you to the social context. Once you understand the social context, you can really start to answer and address some of the more interesting questions. Okay, go to the next slide. Again, the ideal location for me, and I ended up at Hopkins Marine Station. This is, basically Pacific Grove, because it's the east side of Monterey Peninsula. Hopkins is here, Lover's Point is here, the aquarium is there. And I didn't exit off, but most of the observations were taken around this area, although I did work anywhere from Heritage Harbor out towards Otter Point. But that population is what was the focus, and again, we're talking about California has a perfect climate for these types of observations. I came from Portland, Oregon, lots of harbor seals there, too cold to be outside or in the water in the wintertime, not going to happen. And not going to happen in many parts of the world where people were studying harbor seals. Again, nobody had ever observed them vocalizing until 1990, and there were plenty of pinniped researchers out there trying. Rocky intertidal is important too. Most of the people that I studied with were working on harbor seals up in Elkhorn Slough. I just don't think you could do the same type of study. Those animals are covered in slough mud. And if you try to watch them underwater, you can't see. You can't even put your hand in front of your face there. So rocky intertidal environment where you can have beautiful clear water. You can also have very murky water, but you can see the patterns when they're underwater and when they're onshore. Protected embayments are really important as well, because this area became, Hopkins Marine Station is really a hub. And I kind of think in a way that, Point Lobos could be that type of hub as well, because it has a really intricate coastline. There are lots of areas. It sounds like mothers and pups are coming to whalers, and I have seen them at Bluefish Cove and some other areas, but those kind of east side areas that are protected from kind of the prevalent northwest swells and winds are kind of where these animals are going to probably try to aggregate. But the important thing is that there are year-round observations to kind of advance studies of these animals. We'll go to the next slide. So this particular slide kind of condenses a whole chapter from my thesis, but I really wanted to focus on underwater stuff. If you want to ask anything about individual identification, we can talk a little bit more afterwards, but it's pretty clear. When it came to Hopkins, you have to understand that in the 1990s, a lot of people were doing biomedical research, and they were coming up with ways to cure cancer, and all I wanted to do was walk outside and look at the harbor seals, because there were hundreds there, and nobody was looking at them. I'm like, really? And there wasn't anything known, and there wasn't even anybody there that I could really talk to about how to go about doing it. So I just kind of went out originally with a pad of paper. I didn't use a camera to identify the animals at first, because when you take a picture of an animal, it's different than what your eye might catch when you're in real time. So you really, I took a pad of paper, and my goal was to identify one animal a day. And I figured in a year, I'd make a huge dent, and I'd know a lot of animals in it, and that's kind of how it worked. And then the pictures came later. Once I knew the animals by sight, then I would go out and photograph them, so I'd have a record of them. But when I first started and took a few pictures, I was like, it didn't make any sense. I had to see them. And this, I just included this photo of, I called her Snow White. Most of the animals that I identified don't have names, because I was embarrassed among all the other researchers at Hopkins that I would be anthropomorphizing too much. And now I think that's all silly. I think you should anthropomorphize as much as you want, name them whatever you want. Give them any emotions you feel they have, because I believe they do exhibit them, many of them. So we're all mammals, we're all warm-blooded, we all have children. We all live here and are residents. So, but this is Snow White, and she was the lightest color variant I hadn't seen. So imagine I'm sitting out there at Hopkins Marine Station, there's seal rocks in the back, and I'm like, how am I going to do this? And there's a big white seal right in the middle, like this big flag. So I'm like, okay, I'll start with her. So whitest variant I'd ever seen, and then a little scar over her eye, and then she had a scar right here. And she would show up, every day, probably. And the best time to look at these animals is as they're hauling out. So it's a little different in beach cove environment, but in an intertidal environment, it's easy because I knew exactly what time they would start coming ashore. And I would just sit there and watch the first one come out, and the next one, and the next one. And you realize quickly that you're watching the same ones over and over each day. That they really, I did a lot of statistics on site fidelity, and some animals will literally haul out on the same rock day after day after day if it's available. They're just like people. Some of these animals are, very meticulous about where they are and what they do, and others are traveling in and out. So there's a lot of variability. But I was able to identify 450 individuals from this population and be able to recognize them just in real time. It's not like take a picture and then go back and compare. I knew who they were, which was key. And that was about 75% of the population plus, and it was 100% of the adult males in the population and about 90% of the adult females, which is the most important aspect. And it turned out about 75% of the population were residents. That means that I could see them each month of the year. They would show up. There were few animals, about 14% that were, I call them non-breeders, which meant that they would disappear for a couple months right around pupping time. And most of them would swim over, and I'd follow a lot of them over to the Pebble Beach fan shell and Cypress parking. Back in those days, they'd be loaded with seals, and now I find, I don't know if you all have noticed, but there aren't that many anymore. And I think it's because a lot of them are staying, at least from our community, they're all at West Beach at Hopkins Marine Station now. They didn't start using that beach to pup until 1997, which, if you remember, was kind of a huge El Nino event. And from February, March, I think February, the mean swell height for that area was almost 12 feet. And some of the females went over to the beaches at Fanshell and Cypress, and they came back after a big storm, and some hadn't pupped yet, and they just decided to stay at Hot. They just, said, why are we leaving? There's this beautiful beach here. There's some weird people up there, but there's been a fence there, and we have Tom protecting us. Nobody's coming down. So they stayed, and subsequent animals that have been born there stay, and so now it's just more animals and more animals and more animals, and they're starting to expand down into Pacific Road, down to 5th Street, and we'll see what happens. But anyway, you can imagine with a community this stable, animals showing up every day and bumping into each other underwater and hauling out next to each other, they have long-lasting relationships, which is kind of critical to understanding their behavior. Next slide. So I kind of had a good understanding of their community. The next step was to get underwater. And I had the advantage, I started snorkeling, freediving underwater at Hopkins in '91, and I really started this study in '95, '96. So I had already had 4 or 5 years in the water with some of these animals. A lot I had identified in '91 as subadults that were curious, and they kind of come up, pick at your fin and kind of grab what equipment you had. And I loved doing it, so I was in the water most days. And by the time I went to do this study, a lot of those animals had matured into young adults, and so I was able to capture behavior on underwater video that probably hadn't really been seen before, because the animals were like, oh, there's that funny looking woman or thing in the blue whatever, and she's looking at us, and oh well, we'll just keep doing whatever we're going to do. So I was able to get some observations, and these are the 3 main behavior types that I'll show some video for, and I'll talk a little bit more about. The display behavior, both acoustic and underwater vocalizations, attending behavior, and then kind of agonistic or competitive behavior, but it can also be kind of also part of social bonding too. And I'll keep emphasizing this. It turns out it's all male behavior. So we'll just go to the next slide. So the first is to kind of focus on the acoustic and visual displays. I think you probably are all familiar, you've probably seen harbor seals splashing at the surface. Like, what the heck is that? And if you look in the literature, there's a whole set of potential functions it could serve, from display to alarm calls. And I have, in all the hours, thousands of hours underwater with these animals, it is a male behavior, but I have seen females, especially with pups, give an alarm splash, but it's not the ritualized slap, slap, slap. They literally slap and they run for it. You know, it's so what I'm going to talk about today is this kind of ritualized, repetitive kind of signal, and it's just a still kind of. But we'll do some video. Bubble blowing also happens as well, and I don't know how obvious that is from the surface. So we'll see it underwater, and then we'll actually have some underwater vocalizations that you can see, which again were first recorded in 1990. Go to the next slide. So this is the bubble blow. And this guy's actually slapping with his whole body, using his foreflippers and kicking, and then he's going to do some probably more bubble blowing, and then a tail slap. The water's filled with bubbles. But I mean, you can see this, he's just saying, I am hot stuff. Look at me and hear me roar. And it is Ty. He's going to slap some more, and now he's going to go, we're not actually getting any volume. Is there a way to get
It's here, but Duff, can you boost this?
It may not be. It may be muted.
Oh, okay. Wait, hold on. Well, I'm going to have to just stop. It was on. I've got to. I got to get out of it, though. Are you okay with that? I'm going to take.
Yeah, if we can get back.
All right. Let me get it. Yeah, here we go. This is our volume. Okay, let me go back.
I can always give you a rough. I can fill in the sound necessary. Let me try.
Is that better? Can you hear that now?
It'll make more sense when they actually start to vocalize, but you can hear some of it. You can stop that if we can go to the next video. You can just click on it, we'll go to the next. So the next one is actually the vocalization display. Can you hear it? So yeah, it's really loud. Not the high-pitched whir, but there's a low line. That was me. I think there's a little bit of I think it's so loud that it's actually interfering with the.
Duff, can you make it lower for me?
But the one thing that you notice is he's rolling over into generally a supine position, and he's contracting his thoracic region and making a, one of my friends said it sounded like a toilet flushing. There'll be more. We'll see if we can get more. We'll go to the next slide. So, okay. Now this to me made the whole study worth it, because it was the most extraordinary set of behaviors I had never seen before. Well, nobody had never seen before that we understood, but it became kind of the key to understand a little bit more about what the function of the underwater vocalizations were. And it's called the attending behavior. If anybody has a better name for it, I haven't really published this, so we can come up with a better name. But so the male vocalizing in this particular image is this guy. and he is on his back in a supine position. He is vocalizing, and this other male has decided, wisely or unwisely, to press his face right up into the muzzle of this other big male. You see scars on, that's kind of a dangerous thing to do potentially, but they just went off and kept doing this and doing this. And then when at its extreme form, you get groups of males. So anyway, I'm not going to talk more about it. You can just go to the next slide and play the video. So these are kind of younger males, just on the verge of adulthood. Physically mature, not socially, probably can't get a female, so they may as well practice. But he's vocalizing, and this other one is just like, hey, just pressing, just gently pressing, there's no aggression happening, just touching whiskers. All males, 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 males. Females are like, and they'll just do this, and do this, and do this. The next video actually is a little bit more impressive because here's the male that's vocalizing. You can see that contraction. And here are groups of males. I think I've seen up to 6 or 7 other males just coming in and gathering around this male, literally just trying to edge in, press up. And he stops for a minute, he'll roll over and start again, and it'll all just, you'll see actually one of them has light blue tags. And that's a male. I think those tags come from the Moss Landing study. So that animal came down from Moss Landing. It was caught in Moss Landing and came down. This male's just continuing to vocalize. I wish the volume was, the sound was working, but yeah. I just wish I knew when it was starting and stopping, but I think he's gonna do one more. They're all gonna like come in again. There he goes. Here we go, one more. And then he's like, I gotta take a breath.
We've got a mic here. I don't know. Yeah, right here. But we'll try for the next one. Okay.
That's really the end of the vocalizing ones, but it's okay.
Do you want to run it again?
If you guys want to run it again.
Well, it's up to you.
Run it again to
All right,
see,
we'll try it.
See if you can hear anything more.
That's all that's coming in.
That's the shrimp. That's snap shrimp crackling. I should be hearing it. I'm not hearing it. Can you hear it? Is it against it? Or you can?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, we're hearing the shrimp, all right?
Yeah. Snapping shrimp. Yeah. All right. We can move on. I don't want to bore you with the behavior.
It's not boring.
I could watch it for like all day.
Yes.
It's so cool. What are we doing?
Yeah, we're just getting, the shrimp must be overpowering them.
Yeah, I think the shrimp is overpowering them.
Okay.
And this is all done while free diving. They don't really like, and there's at one point you can see me just fly up to the surface and my arms are like, oh, I want to get this.
Oh, wow. I think you needed to tell the shrimp to be quiet.
Yeah. And they overpower all the acoustics on the video camera. Okay. So, and then I kind of moving on to just included these 2 other behaviors as well, because you see it a lot. And in the literature, and I think I get more people saying, oh, this is like 2 seals mating. And because it's generally paired, rolling and chasing, and then mounting. And people are like, I've seen it, I've seen mating. And I didn't include it in this talk, but I have seen a young harbor seal male will mate with anything. I have seen necrophilia, and they will mate with each other. I mean, they will anything to practice. If you think about it, a female harbor seal can be an estrus for a day or 2, and if a male doesn't know what to do, I mean, he's not going to have a chance. So they do spend a lot of time practicing. So these are some of the behaviors that are related, and they're also behaviors that you'll see a lot when you're standing above and you're looking down. So you go to the next slide. This is kind of this pairwise, kind of competitive behavior, but it's not very aggressive. Sometimes it can be really gentle, sometimes it can be really fast, sometimes it includes biting, sometimes the biting is held, so it almost looks like mounting. And you can just see as they flip over, you can see the penile opening. Two male, there's that his opening, and there's his opening, and they're even starting to bulge a little bit. But yeah, you'll see this. The two animals will do this for hours sometimes on end, and it looks very suspicious in terms of. And there have been studies before that attribute it to mating. So and here, this is another male pair, and they're gonna all of a sudden look back like, oh, somebody's watching us. We've been caught. Anyway, so you can see how getting underwater was very important, and how there can be a lot of confusion about what's happening until you really get there to see what's going on. So I had built up, kind of categorized the underwater behavior, and the next step was to really focus on the individuals and who was doing what to whom and how long. And so again, individual identification was incredibly important. This picture this is taken from a video, and I didn't put the video in, but it's my favorite picture of the rumbling and attending, or the roaring and attending, because their faces are just like, they look like a flower, kind of. This picture, it's still taken from video that was taken in 1997, but this male had been identified as early as 1991 as already an adult male, so he was probably 10, 11, 12 at this point in time. And his attendants were all identified as a 93, probably more sub-adult age, 3 or 4, but add 4 more years on, and they're young adults. So I was basically identifying these animals as I'm in the water, taking video, and then going through the video afterwards just to make sure. And then on top of that, you can go to the next slide, we were able to take recordings of the vocalizations from each individual animal. So this is just a basic sonogram. This is looking at the recording in time and just the frequency or loudness of the behavior. And then this up here is a vertical slice of the roar that kind of gives you this dark band. Is this peak here? And that kind of gives you the lowest frequency associated with that call. And most of what we looked at what I looked at was the roar in particular, but the pre-roar kind of starts out like, and then call this the step because it sounds like a step up. And then the roar. Like that. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. For any female harbor seals in the area, next slide. So, again, the attending behavior was key because all of a sudden I had some evidence for social hierarchy among these animals, in particular, again, all male behavior. And I had actually established kind of a 5-tier relationship in terms of who attended whom from sub-adult to adult. So this sub-adult had attended this male had attended this male had attended this male, and this male had attended this. That's not to say this male hadn't also attended that male, but this was kind of an older adult male. This was just a young guy who was just learning how to call. So younger males tending to attend older males, smaller males attending larger males, no fighting happening. And you know that harbor seals fight. I mean, you see scarring on the neck. there was no fighting going on during any of this behavior. And the animals are incredibly vulnerable to aggression at this point, revealing their throats. I think the only thing in the literature I could really find that was anything like it are what wolves do. They call, and there's a kind of a dominant male, and the other pack males come up, and the bottom line is he bares his throat because he knows if another male tries, or any other males think they're going to try, they're going to get their butt kicked, so they don't. Because they know the pecking order, they're not going to risk it. So the next thing was looking at these types of behaviors in relation to, or the attending behavior in relation to the other behaviors, specifically comparing some males who, when they roared, nobody cared, and males that roared and everybody did care, everybody attended. So these males who, you find them out there kind of on the fringe sometimes, or maybe they'd be in the kind of the central area if there are no other males around, calling and calling and calling. If you looked at their behavior over time, they spent a lot of time rolling with other males and attending other males. Whereas this is the male right here who's doing the vocalization. He's actually not supine in this position, but males like this guy would spend, who were attended a lot, spend most of their time when they're around, vocalizing and doing these kind of elaborate splash displays amidst all the other animals. So kind of as if to say, I can splash and do whatever I want, and nobody's going to bother me. Just, come if you want. Do you want a piece of me? You can come get me. But nobody really challenges. So, next slide. So the next step then was to actually put the behaviors together with the vocalization characteristics. And again, the two that we looked at was the length of the roar, and then how deep or high-pitched the roar was. And the pattern was pretty obvious, but again, the animals that, when they roared, nobody cared, had shorter, higher-pitched roars. The animals who roared and got all the attention had longer, deeper roars. So it's clear that there's some information being passed along through those calls, and it's going to be relevant to females when it comes around to mating season. I think the interesting thing that was that we also saw are there were some males that were attended some of the time and roared alone some of the time, and their calls were right in the middle, which is what you would like to see. Next. So the next step was, this is just kind of an example, to create kind of a dominance matrix to kind of see if we could identify some type of real social rank based on the behaviors. So you had, this is just, again, example, 3 different males, same male is across from one another. The wins are on the horizontal and the losses are on the vertical. And a win, it was considered a win when an animal was the vocalizer and somebody attended. So with that pairing, the vocalizer got a +1 and the other guy got a -1, or basically he didn't get anything. But it wasn't just attending that he used to it, also those kind of aggressive displays of splashing and roaring and bubble blowing. So if another male could come in and what you'd see sometimes is a male would vocalize, and either somebody would attend him, or he'd go attend somebody else, or another male would come along and just jump on him and then start attending, and then this guy would stop. So if you had that kind of situation where a male came in and this guy was vocalizing and he put a stop to it and then got to vocalize, that was another win. And so you could start to see some type of social rank with respect to just these pairwise comparisons. So this seal right here had 2 encounters, or 2 days worth of encounters with this male, in which he was the more, he was the one who was vocalizing and this guy was attending. Between these guys, it was 5 times. And for the most part, it was relatively straightforward. These 2, though, also had This guy won one time, and this guy won 2 times, so he kind of won out overall. But you could see that the social structure or hierarchy existed. It maybe wasn't exactly linear. There were probably more animals of higher rank that kind of were relatively equal, but there were definitely these levels where other animals just were subordinate, and I think a lot of it had to do with their age and experience and stuff like that. So that was, once we got the social rank figured out, then we compared that, next slide, to the calls themselves, and this was kind of neat because as the social rank increased, for the most part, so did their roar duration. And that makes sense because the animals are probably bigger, in good condition, and more experienced. They've had a lot of practice. And so these 5 points correspond with these 5 particular males. And so the top 5 had some degree. You can actually go to the next because it's animated, but those top 5 are kind of go very nicely with that line. It's okay, you can go to the next slide. So I'm going to just go a little quicker, but just quickly with this, the neat thing was also seeing evidence of animals increasing their status over time. So this male was an attendant a lot of the time in '97 to this male. By 2001, now this male is this guy, and he's now the big kahuna. And this guy had passed away, and these young males are now attending him. So kind of see that progression if you watch these animals long enough. Next slide. Big question, what the heck are the females doing? I mean, this is all fun and cool, but what are the males doing? So, what are the females doing? And females weren't doing a lot. Underwater, they're watching. They're sleeping, especially if they're pregnant. I mean, really like sleeping in the midst of these raucous displays. And then the females that had never mated before, but probably this might be the first season they start mating, they are kind of in and watching and occasionally for bush scratching. I didn't show any video of it, but it's kind of interesting. But it's almost like they're kind of like they know something is supposed to happen and it's supposed to be related to those males, but I'm not ready to do it yet. So they would just get the males kind of hot and bothered and then disappear, scared after the males came after them. Next slide. But the best thing to do is kind of put it into the context of their annual cycle. So you have January, April, July, October. So for the most part, and this isn't quite making sense because there's an animation here, but they, the main categories are overwintering for the most part. And then pupping and mating season, mating is kind of in this general area. And then molting season happening through here where also animals are molting and the females are also getting weight back from when they have pupped and before their egg before their egg implants and they actually start to gestate their pup. But so that first animation that came up is to say that these seals are social year-round. That behavior, the rolling, the vocalizing, it's happening year-round, which is really interesting because in other parts of the world there's been a lot of work done in the British Isles, and those seals only vocalize during mating season. And so I think there's something to be said for Monterey Bay Canyon and how seals have it really good here. There's lots of food, and they're in good shape most of the time, and they interact and socialize all throughout the year. But then the main time of the year that you see that really, the group behavior, this attending behavior is right when the first pups are being born, right just before and right that first week. So the end of March, maybe just barely into April. And I think what's happening is, next slide, the females with young pups aggregate. And you know, they're all pupping kind of on a nice, safe beach somewhere where these guys, you know, they like to pup where they can get on shore and it's calm, and all the males are all there. And they're all doing this crazy behavior because, I mean, the females are busy and they want nothing to do with the males. And the males are like, God. So I think they're setting up, they're setting up dominance hierarchies. They're starting to practice. They're starting to get all their ducks in a row. And then, as you can go to the next slide, when the pups get just a little bit older, it doesn't even take that long, within a week or two, they start to disperse quite a bit and travel a little bit more. And the males, you know, that aggregate behavior, the males, the attending, it starts to disappear. And I think that the males are starting to kind of ooze out on shore as well. And there are all these little rocky spots. And you can start to see one male haul out here, a male haul out there. They start to kind of distribute themselves along shore. Following kind of the females again. You can switch it. The females are kind of controlling, you know, where the males are going to go. So anyway, this is really just the last slide. You know, we're kind of going full circle in terms of, you know, if you learn anything about mating strategy based on any of these behaviors, and we know that these guys have long-term and lasting relationships, and I think these social hierarchies are mediated through both their vocalizations and the attending and other types of behaviors. As the females are dispersing, I think the animals are starting to distribute themselves based on where they fit in the pecking order. They know kind of what areas they know all the other males that are around and what areas they can occupy, and using these areas as display areas. And it may even be because I've seen such kind of intense interactions between males that they could have the possibility to actually build some alliances to kind of help each other. But again, it comes down to the female getting to be the one who chooses who she mates with. But it's the irony, of course, is that at the time when she's supposed to choose, she's in the worst possible condition you can imagine. Her weight is down. There's nothing left of her. She's probably in estrus for a couple days. And it's probably really quick, and it's happening as she goes out to sea at night to feed, or maybe as she comes back in. But the bottom line is, all those hours underwater, never ever saw a mating, ever. So, and I mean, we go out at night sometimes. And of course, you know, the animals are all like distracted by lights and stuff like that. But anyway, I don't think there really has been. You know, I've heard of people saying, well, I think I saw a mating along the beach one time, but in terms of really seeing like that happening over and over and being able to actually look at what's really going on, I mean, they've completely eluded us. So anyway, there's still plenty to learn about harbor seals, but hopefully this gives you a little bit better understanding of what's going on and what you're seeing out in the water, what you are able to see close to shore. And with that, if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer.
We do have time for a few questions with them. Wait for the mic, please. With them. Thank you.
When the female goes into estrus, does she seek out the males, or do the males by pheromone or something know that she's in estrus?
I think it's probably a combination of the two. I think males can sense when females are in estrus, and I think females probably know. You know, I do a lot of sea otter research, and there's this kind of when you see a mating between sea otters, it can be pretty aggressive, but there's a complicitness to what the female is doing. It takes both. A male cannot overpower a female underwater. I mean, and it doesn't help to be bigger or stronger. If you're smaller, you can go. So that's the whole part of the mating strategy for these animals. That females, you know, the belief that females have a choice and they are involved in some way. You know, maybe just for a few minutes. I don't know. It doesn't take that long.
Does the high and the low tide affect when the mams go onto the beach for pupping?
That's a good question. You know, I focused a lot on when animals were coming and going and what the males were doing. I didn't spend as much time with mothers and pups. I didn't tide had as much to do with pupping as sometimes time of day. Seem to see a lot of births in the wee hours of the morning and in the evening, but it's not to say you can see a birth right in the middle of the day. I don't know how much control sometimes they have over the exact time. And the interesting thing about the beach environment, most of the beaches that they use, they can have access to a lot of those areas at high tide and at low tide. The problem with the beaches where there is some high tide access, if there's any swell or storm at all, I mean, I've seen females give birth to a pup in a high tide on a beach and have their pup seconds later washed off and gone. So, I mean, there's some whimsical nature to all. They don't have all that control.
Two more questions.
The other day at Whalers, I thought I saw a harbor seal, like porpoise out of the water with some, actually it was some kelp, and he did it 3 times.
I think it's a
So they would do that,
Yeah.
because it was very playful behavior.
No, and that's, I think when I was showing the rolling behavior and some of the mounting behavior, a lot of it, I think, are these younger males, subadult to young males that are just, their hormones are going, and there's all this, hormones around us from females that are pupping, and they porpoise and like grow out things and shake, and and it's just, it's practice, it's play, it's, they're developing their strength and skills, and I mean, you can see it throughout the year.
Okay, I have a question. If I'm looking at the pups with visitors, I've gotten the question a couple times. How many times can a mother give birth during her lifetime? Do we know that?
Well, the things that we do know are that females can give birth to one pup every year. And so the next thing is, what's the lifespan of a female? They can start pupping probably as young as 3, maybe 3 or 4. And I have watched the population at Hopkins for 20 years, and there are still some females around that were there 20 years ago, so they can live into their 20s to mid-20s. So they could have 20 pups, potentially. Again, you have to think about the variability of I have seen years, and I know Tom Aikman has been keeping track of the Hopkins population. There are such things as good years and bad years, so it's natural for females to potentially, lose. I think the chance of a pup surviving every year is like 50 to 60%, and then add on to that if there's a bad year, lean year in terms of an El Nino or something like that. But yeah, they can have a lot of pups.
Jerry, thank you very much for this.